final question. What advice or word of exhortation would you even give to, Christians today, particularly young Christians, I guess, that are coming up into the university system?
Yeah, well, look, my words of encouragement, of exhortation to young Christians is that, never forget that Christ rose from the dead. The victory is won. Christ is triumphant.
Yeah.
It's happened. It's more than just a hope that we have. It's a fact that we stand on. And nothing any of your lecturers can say can mitigate that fact that Christ is risen. And that's something that should be the absolute basis of their worldview, the way they see everything, that Christ is risen. But secondly, what I would actually say to young people who go into universities, don't believe everything your lecturers tell you. They're human beings.
As a lecturer,
absolutely. Yeah. Look, something. I'll be honest. I've been been an academic now for 18 years. I look back on my career and I think, I really I was wrong about that. I thought I was right, but I was wrong. And all academics, their views change throughout their careers.
So, okay.
Yeah.
What would you say you were wrong on that you've taught already? Can you give an example?
Well, I could, but they're often quite embarrassing. But let me think of one. I can think of several, I suppose. How
have your ideas matured and changed and grown?
I think I have a much greater appreciation for the way that we think and the way that we live is not as much shaped by ideas as it is by technology, as it is by the economy and things like that. So if you'd have spoken to me 18 years ago and said, hey, why do you think society is the way it is? I'd have said, well, you've got these philosophers who had these ideas became very influential in the universities, people started hearing them and changed the way that it would be very much a history of ideas. And there is a school of thought which basically says that ideas rule history, ideas rule society. I don't really believe that anymore. I think it's far more complicated than that. And so I guess what I would say is that 18 years ago when I used to teach how society works, why it's turned out the way it is, if I was to watch my lectures now, I'd probably be embarrassed. I think they were too simplistic. It's not that they were wrong, but I would say that they were far too simplistic. And then there have been some things that I've just been wrong about, and I'm too embarrassed even to say them. But I'm happy to say there have really only been two occasions in my career when I was just so wrong about something it was really embarrassing. So it's 2 in 18 years. I'm human. Look. When I started university, I was absolutely dazzled by my lecturers. And you know something? In a sense, rightly so, because they were brilliant. They were the smartest people I'd ever come across. Look, my old man, my late father, had a PhD. He was really smart. But these lecturers who'd basically spent the last 20, 30 years full-time writing, researching, discussing these ideas, they were just in a league that I'd never encountered before. And I was just dazzled with them. But at the same time, I was lucky because I kind of had my father as well, who could say, well, something, that's where they're coming from. But here are some good books which will give you a different point of view. And he gave me books of philosophy written by people who were not in the course outline, books of philosophy, books of history. And I was able to sort of do my own reading, and which sort of functioned as something of a counter view.
Is that important, do you think, for young people coming through?
If you're going through university, it's absolutely important that you read books by really good Christian historians, Christian philosophers, apologists. So
give us 5. 5 books every Christian should be reading when they go through uni.
Well, it's... I don't know if I can talk about books, like actual titles of books, but I would talk about authors. I do actually think Ravi Zacharias is excellent. Look, I think someone like Roger Scruton, who seems to have had a profession of Christian faith towards the end of his life, I think Roger Scruton is very good. I think in terms of sort of studying things like philosophy, I think there are great Christian philosophers out there like William Lane Craig and J.P. Moreland. They've written fantastic books. Norman Geisler, the late now Norman Geisler, he wrote many fantastic books on Christian apologetics and philosophy. Most of them are of an introductory level from Geisler, but more technical works have been written by people like William Lane Craig and J.P. Moreland. Alvin Plantinga, he's written more technical works. I mean, honestly, log on to the Wandering Bookseller, whose shop is down in Katoomba in New South Wales. Log on to the Wandering Bookseller.
Excellent bookshop.
It's a great bookshop. I love that bookshop, but
I spend too much money when I go there.
Yeah, last time I was there, which was a year ago, I spent $250.
Yeah.
Carl Grice, the proprietor, he was happy about that. He smiled.
Sure he would.
Yeah. But the wondering, and the good thing about that shop is, he's got a real interest in ideas, philosophical ideas, and reaching young people.
Yeah.
And start with things that are fairly accessible. And I think Ravi Zacharias is pretty good. And also, for all the subjects that you study in history, there are usually alternative interpretations of those things. So to give you one example, if you study the Enlightenment at university, you'll be taught that basically the Enlightenment killed God, it hated religion, and it was basically a pagan movement, a very popular point of view by certain Enlightenment historians. But there's another view of the Enlightenment which says, well, the French Enlightenment kind of was like that, but the British Enlightenment was not. The British Enlightenment was actually much more hospitable to Christianity. And of course you had some people like David Hume and Gibbon who were anti-Christian in many ways, but by and large English Enlightenment thinkers believed that there were reasonable expressions of Christianity and that you could actually be a Christian and quite reasonable. The great example of someone like that would be someone like William Paley, the very famous Church of England minister who wrote several books defending Christianity as a reasonable... So look, that's just one example where, getting back to your academics are not omniscient and it's easy to be absolutely dazzled by them. But if they say something that you really struggle with or something that you're really concerned about, don't just suddenly throw away all your beliefs. Honestly, look into it, because let me tell you, your academics are not neutral. They are not neutral. They have their worldviews as well. Now, I'm not saying they're bad people. I'm not. Yeah, a lot of them are. No, not really. But they're not bad people. But they are coming at things from their point of view. They've got worldviews. They've got comprehensive worldviews. And you've got your comprehensive worldview. Listen to what they say, but don't forget that they are not neutral. But the other thing I want to say about university is, to be honest, I loved university. I loved every minute of it. All my lecturers, except for one, were either Marxist or sort of left-leaning, and I was conservative right-wing. But I loved it, and I learned a lot from my lecturers. I loved it. I wouldn't change anything. But the other thing was I was switched on. I knew that just because my lecturer said something didn't mean that it had the authority of a scientific experiment or a mathematical formula. They are coming at it from their own philosophical perspective, and there are always alternative views. And so if you're a Christian going through university and you hear things that are really worrying, honestly, don't be worried. Look it up. Ask people. Find someone who's gone through university who you respect and ask them about it. And be very careful, because, as a Christian, you've got to remember that just because you're not a Christian doesn't mean that you don't have an alternative worldview. Every human being has some worldview. And if it's not a biblical worldview, it's going to be another kind of worldview. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a particularly coherent worldview, but it will be a worldview shaped by all sorts of intellectual forces, shaped by cultural Marxism, shaped by something like postmodernism, shaped
liberal
by
capitalism.
Liberal capitalism. It's shaped by lots of things. And so when you are listening to your lecturers speak, be aware that they are coming from a point of view. And their point of view is not necessarily biblical, and it's certainly not necessarily correct. And when you keep that in mind, you're going to find university much easier. Don't think that your lecturers know everything, and don't think that they're coming from a position of pure neutrality. They are not. And when you realize that, if they say something that is really worrying to you, you won't be as worried, because you just think, well, you know something, I'll look into that. I don't need to worry about that right now. I'll think about that when I get a chance. And this is the other thing, Mark. Let's say you and I are having a debate. Let's say you and I are having a debate over your heritage, and
South Sea Island.
Yes, South Sea Island. Well, let me do this. Let me do this another way. Now, were you adopted by any chance?
No.
Okay, you weren't adopted.
My sister was.
Okay, fine. Let's say we were having a discussion. I said to you, "You're adopted," and you're like, "What? I'm not adopted. I know I'm not adopted. Mother and father never said that I was adopted. Quite the opposite. In fact, I asked them every day, "Are you sure I'm not adopted?" And they said, "Sorry, son, you're not." And I say, I whip out a piece of paper that looks pretty authentic to you, showing that actually you were adopted. Now, at that point, you are silenced. But does that mean you have an obligation to believe me at that point? Of course not. Just because someone says something that you can't respond to doesn't mean that at that moment you are obliged to change your mind. What you are obliged to do as a sort of a responsible thinking human being is to look into it. So when you're at university and your lecturers say things and you're like, wow, man, I can't square that with my biblical Christianity. That doesn't mean you're obliged at that moment to change your views. Because
test it against the evidence.
Of course.
See if the document's real. See if,
Exactly, and sometimes ideas take years to test because you've got to see them unfold in reality. The point that I'm making is I have this fear that a lot of Christians kind of get into this mindset where they hear something that doesn't square with their understanding of the Bible, and so they think, oh well, I guess I'm obliged now because
Bible's got to go.
I'm intelligent. I'm an intelligent person. I've got to throw the Bible out. No, I mean I'll use a technical term now. We are not under any epistemic obligation to change our minds the moment we encounter evidence that we cannot respond to. Our only epistemic obligation is to look into it further.
Yeah, then that takes true courage and humility, doesn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. And again, that's another thing that if Christians really understood that, it would make university a less traumatic experience for them.
And a much richer one.
Absolutely, because like I said, look, I'll just say it, I loved university. University's great. You'll learn a lot of good things. There's a lot of great stuff to be learned at university, and it's actually really good as a Christian to encounter non-Christian ideas, to encounter them and scrutinize your own ideas, scrutinize those ideas, because that can actually be incredibly enriching. It can actually galvanize, it can actually strengthen your faith. If there's one thing that sort of strengthened people's faith, that for all its imperfections, capitalism was a pretty good system, was watching the alternatives in action. It wasn't necessarily positive arguments in favour of capitalism. It was actually watching the alternatives unfold. And the same thing with democracy.
Chairman Mao, Pol Pot, Stalin.
Absolutely. And the same thing with democracy. It's like, everyone knows that democracy has its problems. And there's a sense in which arguments in favour of democracy are probably hardly as persuasive as when you actually look at countries that are not democratic. Like, they're the best arguments in favour of democracy. And I would actually argue that the best arguments in favour of Christianity are kind of negative arguments. Get rid of a biblical worldview. Get rid of creation, fall, redemption. Get rid of the idea that we're sinners and bring in the idea that we can be perfected. Bring in the idea that life has no objective meaning, we're not created by a God, and see what you wind up with. And history shows that what you wind up with is not pretty. Does that mean that everything in the history of Christianity has been great? Of course not. But all things considered, Christianity historically has been a great blessing to the human race. And even nowadays, what we're seeing is atheistic non-Christians saying that. And why are they saying that now? Because it's becoming very apparent what happens socially when you get rid of ideas to the effect that human beings were created with a purpose, that human beings have inalienable dignity. When you get rid of traditional Christian ideas of gender, what it means to be male and female, and when you get rid of Christian ideas like everyone is created in God's image, and replace that with the idea, well, everyone is really just on a quest for power, which is sort of classical postmodernism, and it's something that it also kind of shares with cultural Marxism. When you get rid of the Christian ideas and you see what replaces them, that is the best argument in favour of Christianity. You know what the best argument in favour of Martin Luther King's Christian civil rights movement is? The best argument?
What's that?
Black Lives Matter. That's the best argument, because look what's happening. Just riots, killings, hatred, division. It's not going to end well. And Black Lives Matter is it's you know what it is? It's a revenge movement. That's what it is.
Yeah.
It's like Martin Luther King's movement was a restorative movement. It was based explicitly on love.
But this is fundamentally different.
This is fundamentally different. Again, this is a radical movement. And again, the best way I can describe its rhetoric of sort of tearing things down, its rhetoric of oppression, of oppressor and the oppressed. It's basically a form of Marxism. And again, when you read Marx, and when you read sort of certain leftist manifestos of the late 1960s and the early to mid 1970s, what the Black Lives Matter movement and what sort of a lot of modern liberation movements are, they're basically a revival of very late 60s, early 70s new leftism, new Marxism, but with transgenderism thrown in. That's kind of what they are. I'm just trying to remember one particular example of this. It's a very good one brought up in Mark Liller's book, The Once and Future Liberal, where he talks about identity politics. And identity politics is most definitely a form of cultural Marxism, which is not to say that it has no links whatever with sort of liberal capitalism. I'm not arguing that at all.
Yeah.
But the way it expresses itself.
Well, you said before it's complicated, it's nuanced. There's a lot of factors coming in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to say that the modern transgender movement, the Black Lives Matter, is not is not in any way related to a mode of thinking that we could call cultural Marxism, and that it's solely a result of liberal individualistic capitalism, is just as simplistic and superficial an analysis as if someone said, well, everything's because of cultural Marxism. Like it's just as unsatisfying. And when you look at the history of ideas, and that is actually that is sort of the area I've researched for the last 20 years. The history of ideas is complicated, and often it's not just a question of looking at a particular movement that's happening and saying, oh, it's because of this book that was written. It's far more complex than that. And
well, I noticed that with like Dr. Michael Jensen, who has put a social media post up critiquing social Marxism, saying he thinks it's a right-wing conspiracy theory and really liberal capitalism has more to do with it. You had a quite involved response to that. Do you want to sum up what you would say?
Well, look, saying that sort of Black Lives Matter, the riots in the US, all sorts of other movements taking place, like, I would say weird gender theories creeping into schools in Australia, safe schools and things like that. To say that that's got nothing to do with cultural Marxism and that it's really all because of sort of capitalist liberal individualism, it's kind of like because these things wouldn't have happened without sort of capitalist individualism. It's almost like saying, the Russian Revolution really wasn't about Marxism, because if there was no capitalism, people wouldn't have been so badly oppressed, and therefore the Russian Revolution wouldn't have happened. So it's really caused by capitalism. Well, no. Like, it's there are multiple things going on.
Yeah.
And so
it's not just one thing.
It's not just one thing.
It's not just cultural Marxism, but then again, it's not just liberal capitalism.
Absolutely not. No. I mean, what happens is that at a deep cultural level, you've got the economy shaping the way we live, which then sort of shapes the way that we think, and that can lead to us looking at the world in all sorts of ways. It can lead to you looking at the world in very individualistic, almost selfish ways. But then if you latch on to other ideas that help you make sense of what's going on, it can make you look at the world in a sense that, well, I'm a victim. And that will often depend on the ideas that you are exposed to. This is not the first period in history where we've had large numbers of people who find themselves not doing as well economically as they would like to be doing. This is not the first time in history that's happened. But
nor will it be the last.
Nor will it be the last. And so the point is, there is something new that's going on today. And well, there are several things that are new that are going on today, and one of them is these ideas that have been pumped out of universities for the last 30 years in terms of society being basically a collection of oppressors and oppressed people. That's a kind of new variable that's been coming out of the universities, and it's shaping the rhetoric and it's shaping the ideas of people involved in certain movements that are trying to deal with the social problems. And so is the society that's been generated by certain problems with liberalism and its secularization and capitalism, is that part of the issue that's going on in the world? Well, sure. I mean, how could you deny that the prevailing economic system isn't having an effect on these things? Of course it is. But we don't live by bread alone. We're not just economic creatures. We also imbibe ideas. And again, one of the ways of thinking that is helping a lot of young people, not all of them, but a lot of young people, to understand the world is what we would describe as cultural Marxism. And so I guess my response to Michael Jensen's post was well, first and foremost, cultural Marxism is a reality, at the very least, in the sense that, it's a term, and this is something that Rob Smith pointed out in a very good article he wrote, and it's available for free online in the journal Themelios, and you should all go look it up. But the actual term cultural Marxism is a term that's been thrown around by academics since the 1970s. In fact, I was just saying earlier, Mark, that a few days ago I had a very long conversation with a friend of mine who's a professor of philosophy here in Australia, and he was marvelling at this idea that people have that cultural Marxism is just a right-wing conspiracy. He was saying that he was a professor in the 80s and 90s. He's just retired now. He says, he was a philosophy professor. He says he remembered the term cultural Marxism was used a lot in the 80s and 90s. It was a perfectly valid term. And it seems to me what's happened is that in the sort of maybe in the later 90s, conservatives started using that term.
They caught on.
Yeah, it caught on. Conservatives started using it to describe the ideas in the universities. And at that moment, leftists started hating the term because the conservatives started liking it. And so at the very least, I mean, no one can deny that there has been this intellectual movement in the universities since the 1980s, which has been described by the academics themselves as cultural Marxism. That is the idea that culture as a whole is oppressive and is a product of the capitalist system, and that culture as a whole, meaning notions of masculinity, notions of femininity, race, nationhood, sexualities, all of these things need to be overthrown because they're oppressive. Like, that is a way of thinking, and it's very close. It's definitely related to postmodernism. Again, it's like, just because you can distinguish cultural Marxism from postmodernism doesn't mean they've got nothing to do with one another, and doesn't mean that they can't sort of operate in some ways together. It's if I can give an example, my field is the history of political thought, and you can distinguish republicanism from liberalism as two traditions, but it doesn't mean that the Republican tradition was in no way influenced by theorists that came out of the liberal tradition. Yeah. You know, it doesn't mean that at all. It's messy. It's messy. Like, the real world is not a textbook of philosophy. Yeah. And the problem is that when people try to sort of declutter everything, and you wind up getting something that's actually not the real, actually real. So intellectually, cultural Marxism is a reality. Now the question though is, okay, fine. There was this movement in the 80s and 90s, beginning probably in the 70s, where Marxist principles were sort of applied more broadly to other areas of culture. Okay, but it had no impact on the world other than in a few university departments. It didn't really have any impact on the world. Everything that's going wrong in the world really now is just sort of secular liberalism and capitalism. My response to that is nonsense, absolute nonsense, because the people who were teaching these cultural Marxist ideas, often in sociology departments, cultural studies departments, well, guess what? They went on training teachers. They went and trained journalists. It's interesting that with the rise of radical ideas in universities, you also have the rise of the professionalization of certain jobs. So that up until probably about 25 years ago in Australia, 30 years ago, if you wanted to be a teacher, you wouldn't necessarily go to university. You'd go to teachers' college. Yeah. The same thing with...
There's a good argument, actually, to bring that back. More on-the-job training.
Absolutely, for sure. And the same thing with journalism. Up until pretty recently, people who wanted to be journalists, they didn't go and do a degree in journalism.
You got a cadetship.
That's right. And you sort of worked your way up. Yeah. But it's interesting that with the rise of radicalism in the universities, you also have the rise of this idea that any job that sort of involves holding a pen, you need a university degree for. And so all these new professions start emerging at the same time that the universities are being radicalized. And so who's training the teachers? Who's training the journalists? Who's training the lawyers? Who's training the future public servants? It's, radicals in the universities. And it's foolish. It is crazy to think that 30 years of radical ideology being taught in universities is not going to have any effect on wider culture over time. That is just nuts. It is just nuts. Because if that's the case, then who cares about teaching the right things then? Like, if you seriously don't think that a mode of thinking being systemically taught in universities over a 30-year period is not really going to have any effect on culture, on society at large, why have universities? What's the point of them then, other than for a bunch of eggheads to be able to sit around and talk about...
So we don't have systemic racism as much as we have systemic leftism.
We've got systemic lunacy, I think, in universities, especially in humanities departments. And these are things that intellectuals have been writing about for years. Roger Scruton, again, is very good on this sort of thing. But it's crazy to think that these ways of thinking have had no impact on culture. Of course they've had an impact on culture. Of course they had.
And Roger Scruton's quite outspoken about that in his BBC series on beauty, and how it's even expressed itself in architecture and the brutalism of modern architecture.
Okay, well, I mean, I haven't looked at that, but I have seen his book, Fools, Frauds and Firebrands, and that was essentially about just bad ideas masquerading as profound ideas, taking over universities, and of course, in some ways, it destroyed Scruton's career as an academic. It didn't destroy his career as a scholar and as an intellectual, and we must be very clear. There's a distinction to be made between an academic and a scholar. Some academics are scholars, some scholars are academics, but not all academics are real scholars, and not all scholars are academics.
Is the academic one that's a career professional going through the institution?
An academic is someone who pays their mortgage through working at a university, through working in a faculty.
A scholar is more of an intellectual purist who's pursuing their own...
Who's pursuing truth. Who's pursuing truth and trying their best not to make the pursuit of truth subservient to any political objective. Now, do they always succeed? No, but at least they try, and that's a very important thing. And so, back to sort of the reality of cultural Marxism. I mean, look it's like I get so frustrated when I hear people say that the things going on in the world today, again, sort of the tearing down of statues, the deplatforming in universities, has nothing to do with a way of thinking known as cultural Marxism. Because I think to myself, well, you know something, if riots in streets, tearing down statues that they consider oppressive, if anarchists in Seattle taking over 6 blocks and turning
the
Chaz zone and turning it into, it's now being called the Chop Zone. Because
why?
Because what I read about it, there was some footage of a group of people in the Chaz zone talking about traitors to the movement, and someone yelled
already.
Out, yeah, that's right. And someone yelled out, and what happened to traitors to the movement in the French Revolution? And the crowd all said, "Chop!" And so now it's
oh my gosh!
Now it's being called the Chop Zone. Anyhow,
wow.
I don't know if anyone's been chopped yet.
Well, it's only been a couple of weeks.
Less. But I mean. But I mean, you've got riots all around America, basically saying that the American society is oppressive. I mean, what more do you want? And when you look at the websites and when you listen to the words of these spokespeople, so to give you an example, it's not on the current Black Lives Matter website, but one of their leading members, who is also a professor, and you can find this on the internet. I've forgotten the fellow's name though. He was on record, I think back in 2017, basically talking about how capitalism is again a sort of white affliction on society, like a disease introduced to society by whites, and so again it's anti-capitalist as well. And so the movements, all these movements are about sort of tearing down sort of heroes of Western civilization, speaking out against capitalism. And yet when someone suggests, something, maybe this is caused by something other than liberal capitalism, it's like, oh no, of course not. Well, I mean, what more evidence do you want? And again, the rhetoric coming from these people, and I've been paying attention to these sorts of people for years now, because you see them on YouTube a lot. The rhetoric that comes from them, from Antifa people, from what are derogatively known as social justice warriors, the rhetoric that comes from them is, we hate capitalism, white people are oppressive, cisgender whatevers, males, females are oppressive. We need to overthrow all of this. There is an ideological force feeding into that, and it's got to be taken seriously. It has got to be taken seriously, and it's not taking it seriously by saying it's just some right-wing conspiracy theory concocted by conservatives. I mean, that's false from an intellectual history point of view, and it's false just in terms of being able to properly explain what's going on today.
Right. Well, Steve, thanks very much.
My pleasure.
It's been excellent. We could do it for another hour. It's great.
I've enjoyed
really
it.
appreciate
Thank
your
you.
time. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.
Cultural Markisms is a production of The Good Source, hosted by Mark Powell. To watch, listen to, or read more content without the SJW PC fact filter, visit goodsource.news. That's good, SAUCE.news. Become a Good Source supporter for exclusive access to live and unedited interview recordings, including the conversations before and after the show.